The chamber was enormous. It had been built to make visitors feel small. The ceiling stretched so high that the upper walls disappeared into shadow, and the seats curved in a perfect circle around the central floor, like a great stone mouth waiting to close. Every species in the Galactic Council had a seat there. The Vreth sat in their high oxygen booths. The Solari floated behind sealed glass tanks, their gas bodies shifting in slow, colored clouds. The Draveki perched on raised bars, their long fingers wrapped tight around the metal like birds on a wire. There were 41 species in total. All of them were watching the human woman standing alone on the central floor. Her name was Director Yael Oren. She was 63 years old, with short gray hair and a straight back, and she wore a plain dark jacket with no medals and no rank markings. She had been chosen to speak for Earth not because she was the loudest or the most powerful, but because she was the calmest. The Council had expected shouting. They had expected threats. They had prepared security measures in case the human representative became violent. Instead, Yael Oren stood with her hands folded in front of her and listened. The High Speaker, a Draveki elder named Sothron, read the charges from a long scrolling screen above the chamber. His voice was translated through speakers in the floor, so every species could hear it in their own language. The charges were not short. They took 14 minutes to read. Earth stood accused of unprovoked military action in the Kelvar system, where a human exploration ship had fired on a Council observation post after receiving what Earth described as a hostile scan. The Council said the scan was routine. Earth said routine scans did not include targeting locks. The argument had been going for 2 years. Then there was the matter of the Draveki colony ship that human vessels had refused to let pass through the Helix corridor, citing what Earth called a security zone and what the Council called an illegal blockade. There were 12 more charges after that. Some were small, some were not. When Sothron finished reading, he looked down at Yael Oren and asked if she had anything to say. She said yes. She said that Earth did not recognize the legitimacy of 6 of the 12 charges, that the remaining 6 were being addressed through Earth's own legal process, and that Earth was prepared to negotiate a settlement on each point, one by one, through the standard arbitration channels. There was a long silence. Then Sothron said that negotiation was no longer on the table. The vote had already been decided before the session began. Yael Oren did not know that, but she might have guessed it. The way the chamber felt when she walked in, the stillness of it, the way none of the representatives met her eyes. It had the feeling of a room where a decision had already been made, and everyone was simply waiting to announce it. The vote was to exile Earth from the Galactic Council, permanently. Earth would lose its trade agreements, its communication relays, its shared navigational charts, and its right to enter any space within 15 light-years of Council territory. Earth would be removed from the galactic community and placed, in the words of the official document, beyond the boundary of civilized space, in the outer fringe, a region of unstable stars and empty systems that no Council species had ever found worth settling. The vote was 41-0. Sothron read the result and then looked at Yael Oren again, waiting for the reaction. That was the moment the whole chamber had been waiting for. They expected anger. They expected the human to say something fierce, something proud. They had seen enough of humanity's history to know how this species responded to being told it had lost. Yael Oren looked at the vote total on the screen above her. She read the document as it was displayed. She stood quietly for a moment. Then the left corner of her mouth moved upward. It was not a big expression. It was small and controlled and almost private, like a person who has just heard something that confirms what they already suspected. She signed the document. She said very quietly, "Thank you for your time." Then she turned and walked out of the chamber. Sothron watched her go. He had been in diplomatic sessions for 40 years. He had seen species beg, rage, collapse, and threaten. He had never seen anyone smile at the moment of their exile. He sat with that image in his mind for a long time after the chamber emptied. Something about it did not settle right. He could not explain why. He told himself it was nothing, a small nervous expression, a person trying to hold herself together in a moment of loss. He filed the session notes and closed the case. 3 weeks later, Earth's government ships began their departure from Council-adjacent space. They moved quietly and in good order. There were no protests, no delays, no last-minute communications asking the Council to reconsider. Earth simply began to go. One of Sothron's aides brought him the departure reports. The aide noted that the humans were moving faster than expected. They had already begun loading colony equipment, deep space fabrication units, long-range survey ships. Things you would bring if you intended to build something in a new place. Not things you brought if you were retreating. Sothron looked at the list. He read it twice. He told the aide to keep monitoring. The aide asked if there was a concern. Sothron sat back in his chair. He thought about Yale Oren's face in the chamber. That small, quiet, almost private smile at the moment of total defeat. "I don't know yet," he said. The outer fringe was not on any map that mattered. The Council's charts labeled it with a word that translated roughly as the remainder. The space left over after everything worth claiming had been claimed. 7 star systems sat out there, none of them stable. 3 had suns that pulsed in slow, irregular cycles, brightening and dimming in patterns that made long-term orbit calculations unreliable. 2 had asteroid fields so dense that navigation required constant correction. 1 had a gas giant that periodically shed its outer atmosphere in great hot waves that stripped the paint off ships that got too close. The last system had nothing in it except a dim red star and a field of drifting metal debris that sensor sweeps had identified as the ruins of structures that had not been built by any known species. The Council had surveyed the fringe twice in the last century. Both times the survey teams had come back with the same conclusion. Nothing useful, nothing safe, nothing worth the fuel cost to visit. The first human ships arrived 11 weeks after the exile vote. Director Yale Oren was not on the lead ship. She was on the 4th ship, a slow and heavy carrier loaded with fabrication equipment, seed banks, water recyclers, and enough raw materials to begin construction on a small station. She stood at the observation window as the carrier made its approach into the first fringe system, and looked out at the unstable sun with the same expression she had worn in the council chamber. Calm, attentive, thinking. Her assistant, a young man named Dav Reyes, came to stand beside her and asked what she was thinking. She said she was thinking about the Aethon. Dav had read the survey notes. The Aethon were the species, or what the council believed had been a species, whose ruins sat in the last fringe system. The council's xenoarchaeologists had visited once, 30 years ago, and had declared the ruins unrecoverable. The structures were damaged, partially melted, and made from materials that resisted every scanning technique the council had. After 3 weeks, the team had packed up and gone home. In the official file, the Aethon ruins were marked as of limited scientific value. Yale Oren had read that file 6 months before the exile vote. She had thought at the time that limited scientific value was the kind of thing you wrote when you had given up on something you did not understand. The first human base in the fringe was built in 60 days. It was not beautiful. It was a cluster of pressurized modules connected by enclosed walkways, anchored to a flat shelf of rock on the only stable moon in the first system. The engineers who built it called it Shelf Station, which was not an official name, but the name stuck because nobody bothered to change it. Power came from a pair of reactor units brought from Earth. Water came from the moon's subsurface ice. Food came from the carriers until the hydroponic modules were running, which took another 3 weeks. By the time Shelf Station was complete, 3 more human ships had arrived in the fringe. One of them went directly to the Aethon system. The team on that ship was small, 9 people, led by a materials engineer named Priya Sen. Priya had read the same council survey file that Yal Oren had read, and she had reached the same conclusion. The council surveyors had scanned the ruins and found that their instruments couldn't read the materials, and they had called that a dead end. Priya thought it was the beginning of something. If your instruments can't read a material, she had written in her request to join the Fringe mission, that is not evidence that the material is worthless. It is evidence that the material is outside your instrument's range. She was right. The Athon structures were made from a compound that did not exist anywhere in the Council's material science databases. When Priya's team took physical samples and began testing them without the standard scanner arrays, they found something that made Priya sit down on the floor of her lab and stare at the wall for several minutes before she was able to speak. The compound stored energy, not like a battery, not like a fuel cell. It stored energy the way a dam stores water, in potential, in structure, in the way its molecules were arranged, and it did not decay. A sample that had been sitting in the ruins of an alien civilization for what carbon dating suggested was roughly 40,000 years, still held measurable energy inside its molecular structure. Stable energy, clean energy, energy that released in smooth, controlled output when the compound was cut in specific ways. Priya sent a message to Shelf Station. The message was 3 words long. It said, "You need to see this." Word spread through the Fringe settlement quickly. More scientists came, then engineers, then more engineers. Within 18 months of the exile, there were 400 people living and working in the Fringe, and the Athon ruins had become the most studied site in human science. The work was not easy. Much of the site was buried or damaged. Many of the structures made no sense at first. The Athon, whoever they had been, had not built the way any known species built. Their geometry was strange. Their structures curved in directions that did not seem to serve any obvious purpose. Their machines, if that was what they were, had no moving parts. But humans were patient when patience produced results, and the results were extraordinary. By the end of the second year, Priya's team had reverse-engineered a working power core based on Athon principles. It was roughly the size of a large suitcase, and produced more clean energy than a standard council reactor the size of a house. When the first test was run, the entire team stood in the observation room and watched the output readings climb past anything their models had predicted, and then climb further, and then settle at a number that one of the junior engineers said out loud, and then immediately covered her mouth like she had said something embarrassing. Priya did not cover her mouth. She wrote the number down in her notebook, tore the page out, put it in an envelope, and sent it to Yale Oren. Yale Oren received the envelope at Shelf Station. She read the number. She looked out the small window at the unstable sun in the distance, which was currently in a bright phase, its light warmer and stronger than usual. She picked up a pen and wrote a reply. The reply was also short. It said, "Start building more." The council did not know any of this. The exile had been intended as a punishment. The Fringe had been selected specifically because it was considered worthless. Soth Ron received occasional automated departure reports from the border monitoring systems, which showed that human ships were continuing to travel into Fringe space, and that no human ships were trying to come back. He interpreted this as compliance. The humans were going where they had been sent and staying there. He did not have anyone watching from close range. The Fringe was far away, and there was nothing out there worth watching. He closed his monitoring reports and moved on to other concerns. He did not think about Yael Oren's smile again for another 4 years. By then it was too late for the thought to be useful. The Vreth came first. They arrived in a convoy of 7 ships, old and slow, the kind of ships that had not been built in a long time, because the species that flew them no longer had the resources to build new ones. The Vreth were a reptilian people, warm-blooded despite the name, with amber eyes and broad, flat faces, and a way of moving that suggested they had once been larger and had slowly shrunk over generations of hard living. Their homeworld, Vreth Prime, had been rich once. That was before the Council had granted development rights to a Draveki consortium 400 years ago. The consortium had taken the metal from the mountains and the minerals from the deep-sea floors, and when they were done, they had handed the contract closure documents to the Vreth planetary government and departed. The planet that remained was still habitable, but only just. The Vreth government had filed 17 formal complaints with the Council over the following century. Each one had been reviewed, delayed, reviewed again, and eventually closed without resolution. The Council's position was that the contracts had been legal, and the development had been conducted within the parameters agreed upon at the time. The Vreth's position was that their planet had been gutted by a foreign corporation, while the Council watched and did nothing. Both positions were technically accurate. Only one of them mattered to the Vreth people who lived with the result. When word reached Vreth Prime that a species called humanity had been exiled to the fringe and was building something out there, the Vreth sent a ship to investigate. When that ship came back and reported what it had seen, a growing settlement, Aethon technology being reverse-engineered, an energy source that could power a planet, and a people who seemed to have no interest in making anyone feel small, the Vreth government called a session that lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, they sent 7 ships. Yael met the Vreth convoy at the edge of the first fringe system. She went out herself on a small shuttle with a translator program and no security escort, which made her staff very nervous. She sat across a table from the Vreth convoy leader, a woman named Reth Govan, who had the careful eyes of someone who had been disappointed many times and was not yet willing to believe this would be different. Yael asked what the Vreth needed. Reth Govan said her people needed a place where they were not being managed. Yael nodded. She said there was room. She said there was one rule. Nobody owned anybody else. Not directly, not through contracts, not through debt, not through any other mechanism that produced the same result by a different name. If that rule was acceptable, the Vreth were welcome to settle in the fringe and build alongside the humans and share in everything that was being found and built. Reth Govan was quiet for a long time. Then she asked what humanity wanted in return. Yael said, someone to help carry the work. The Vreth settled in the second fringe system, around the moon of a gas giant that had a breathable atmosphere and a mineral content that made the Vreth engineers practically emotional when they ran their first soil samples. They had not seen ground this unextracted in 2 generations. After the Vreth came the Solari. The Solari were complicated. They were gaseous beings, which meant their biology did not easily translate into most physical environments, and much of their culture was conducted through patterns of color and density within their bodies that other species could observe but rarely understand. The Council had classified them as non-sentient for the first 200 years of contact, which was incorrect, and when a researcher finally proved the classification wrong, the Council had updated its records and apologized in formal language and done nothing else. The Solari had no vote. They had no seat in the chamber. They had no trade agreements because the Council did not recognize their government as a legitimate government. They had, however, a detailed understanding of atmospheric chemistry that no other known species could match, because when your body is made of gas, you pay attention to gas. When a Solari scouting cloud arrived in the fringe and found human engineers struggling with the atmospheric processors in the second system, the ones that were supposed to make the Vreth moon more comfortable and kept malfunctioning, there was a period of about 3 hours during which the humans and the Solari stared at each other and tried to figure out how to communicate. Then one of the Solari shifted their body into a pattern that, as best the human observers could interpret it, depicted the problem with the atmospheric processor and the solution simultaneously. The processor was fixed in 40 minutes. After that, conversation became easier. By the end of the 3rd year, 4 more species had come to the fringe. The Keth, a small aquatic people whose ocean world had been rerouted into a Council shipping lane without their knowledge, and was now plagued with noise and chemical pollution from passing freighters. The Oman Sai, who had two languages, one for inside their communities and one for dealing with outsiders, and who had been using the outside language with the council for so long they had nearly forgotten the inside one. The Brelth and the Fayan, who had been at war with each other for 60 years over a territorial dispute, the council had declined to mediate because neither species was considered strategically important. The Brelth and the Fayan showed up in the fringe within 3 weeks of each other, each unaware the other was coming. That meeting took a lot of patient conversations and some very tense meals, but it resolved. Yael Oren sat in the room for all of it. She did not take sides. She asked questions and listened to the answers, and occasionally pointed out when one side had misunderstood something the other side had said. By the end, the Brelth and the Fayan had agreed on a joint settlement in the fourth fringe system, with a boundary line they had drawn themselves. It held. In the 5th year after the exile, the Fringe Compact was written. It was not a long document. It said that all species in the Fringe were equal members of the Compact, regardless of biology, government type, or previous council classification. It said no species could claim ownership of another or create conditions that functioned as ownership. It said that all scientific knowledge discovered in the Fringe, including everything derived from the Aethon ruins, was shared freely among all Compact members. And it said that decisions would be made by a rotating council, in which every member species had one vote, and the chair rotated every 2 years. It was signed by 7 species. Yael Oren signed it last. She signed it with the same pen she had used to sign the council's exile document 5 years before. Nobody planned it that way. It was just the pen she had. The first patrol ship that went silent was the DSV Rethkan, a Draveki border monitor, assigned to the outer edge of council territory. It was not assigned to enter the Fringe. Its mission was routine, a monthly pass along the boundary, to record any unauthorized movement, send a report, and return to its station at the relay post in the Kelvar system. The Rethkan completed its approach to the Fringe boundary, sent a brief automated position check, and then went quiet. The Draveki Fleet Command waited 72 hours before sending a second ship to investigate. That ship found the Rethkan exactly where it was supposed to be, sitting at the boundary line in one piece, all systems functional. The crew was fine. The ship was fine. The report logs were fine. What was missing was any communication from the 11-hour window during which the Rethkan had apparently been in visual range of the Fringe. The crew of the Rethkan said they had seen things they needed to report to a senior officer before they put it in writing. The senior officer who received that report brought it to Sothran. Sothran read the crew's verbal account carefully. The Rethkan's crew had observed, at long range, what appeared to be a station complex in the first Fringe system. Not a small cluster of modules, a complex, with docking rings, with ships moving in and out in an organized pattern, with what their sensors, operating at the limits of their range, identified as power output readings that were not consistent with any technology the Council had on record. Sothran sent a second patrol. He gave them orders to approach more closely, but not to cross the boundary. That patrol came back with images. The images showed a city. Not a large city, not yet, but it was unmistakably a city. Structures built for permanence, roads between them, ships in organized queues at 3 separate docking facilities, construction frames going up around new buildings at the edge of the settlement. And around the first station, like rings, were more structures, smaller, clearly of different design, and on the hull of each one a different flag or marker that the Council's recognition database identified, after a long moment of processing, as belonging to the Vreth, the Solari, the Keth, and 3 other species. Sothran called an emergency session of the Council's Security Committee. The meeting lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, the committee agreed on 2 things. First, that they did not fully understand what they were looking at. Second, that they needed to understand it quickly. They sent a diplomatic ship rather than a military one. The decision was partly cautious and partly practical. Sending a military vessel to the fringe border would require explaining why, and explaining why would require admitting that something unexpected was happening out there, and the Council's internal communications on that point were not yet ready to be public. The diplomatic ship crossed the boundary and was met within 6 hours by a compact escort vessel. The escort was not threatening. It was simply present, keeping pace with the diplomatic ship at a polite distance, its communications array active and broadcasting on standard Council frequencies. The message it sent was cordial. It said that the Fringe Compact welcomed the Council vessel, and asked if they could state the purpose of their visit. The Council diplomats asked to speak with whoever was in charge. The response came back. There was no single person in charge, but a representative of the Compact Coordination Council would be made available within the day. The representative who arrived was a young woman named Sarah Oren. She was Yael Oren's granddaughter. She had grown up in the Fringe, born in a habitat module in Shelf Station's third expansion phase, and she had the easy confidence of someone who had never known a world where she was unwelcome. She came aboard the Council diplomatic ship without a security team, which unsettled the Council diplomats, and she brought tea, which unsettled them further because they had not expected hospitality. She sat down and asked what the Council wanted. The lead diplomat, a Draveki named Korsavan, said the Council wanted to understand the nature of the Fringe Compact. Sarah said that the Compact was a community of species who had chosen to live in the Fringe and work together. Korsavan said the Council was interested in the technology the Compact appeared to have developed. Sarah said the Compact had developed quite a lot of technology, yes. There was a pause. Korsavan said the Council would like access to that technology through standard treaty arrangements. Sarah said that was interesting, and asked what the Council was offering in exchange. Another pause. The Council diplomats had come prepared for many kinds of conversations. They had not come prepared for the Fringe to have something the Council wanted. In their planning sessions before departure, the assumption had been that the Fringe was struggling, that the humans and whatever species had joined them were surviving but not thriving, and that the offer of Council membership or trade access would be received with something close to relief. Sarah watched the pause with patient eyes. Then she opened a case she had brought with her and placed a single object on the table. It was roughly the size of a closed fist, made from Aethon compound, matte and dark in color. She pressed 2 specific points on its surface, and it began to emit a low, clean hum. And a meter on the side showed a power output reading that made Korsavan's translator briefly malfunction, because the number was outside the range the program had been built to handle. She let them look at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and put it back in the case. The Compact produces these, she said. At present, only Compact member species have access to them. But we are open to discussing arrangements. It was printed on compact paper, which had a different texture from Council paper because it was made from a vreth plant that grew well in the second system's soil. Korsavan picked it up and read it. The document was not an application for Council membership. It was not a request for anything. It was a list of terms under which the Fringe Compact would be willing to open trade discussions with the Galactic Council. The terms were polite, clearly written, and not negotiable. One of them stated that any species currently denied Council recognition on grounds the Compact considered arbitrary, a list was attached, would need to be granted provisional recognition before trade discussions could begin. Korsavan read the list. The Solari were on it. So were 11 other species. He looked up at Sarah Oren. She smiled. It was a small, quiet, almost private smile. He had never met Yael Oren. He did not know why that expression made him feel like he had already lost. Yael Oren was 94 years old, and she lived in a room on the 14th floor of the Compact Archive building in what had once been called Shelf Station, and was now called New Kashar, which was a city of 300,000 people and growing. Her room had a wide window that faced east, and in the mornings, when the fringe sun was in its bright phase, the light came in warm and gold and filled the whole room. She drank her tea by that window most days. She had slowed down enough by then that tea and light and a good window was most of what she needed from a morning. The interview had been arranged for 2 months. The young man conducting it was named Tev Kors, and he was the son of Korzavan, the Draveki diplomat who had sat across a table from Sarah Oren 11 years ago and read a list of trade terms he had not been prepared for. Tev was not a diplomat, he was a historian. He was writing a book about the first decade of the Fringe Compact, and he had requested an interview with Yael Oren twice before. Both times her office had said she was busy. The third time she had said yes, on the condition that the interview was kept to 2 hours and that she did not have to stand for any of it. Tev arrived with a small recording device and a list of prepared questions. He sat across from Yael in a pair of chairs near the window, and she looked at him with the clear, steady eyes of someone who was old and tired but not at all soft, and asked what he wanted to know. He started with the early years, the settlement, the Aethon ruins, the energy cores. She talked through those events in the precise, ordered way of someone who had told the story before and knew which details mattered. She remembered names and dates with the ease of someone who had lived with them for 30 years, and they had worn grooves in her memory. She talked about Priya Sen and the first power core test, and her voice was warm when she said Priya's name. The warmth of someone who had watched a person do something extraordinary from close range. She talked about the Vreth arriving, and Reth Govin's careful eyes, and the conversation on the shuttle. She talked about the Solari and the broken atmospheric processor. She talked about the Brelth and the Thane, and the long, careful meals. After about 40 minutes, Tev set down his list of prepared questions and asked the one he had actually come to ask. He said, "The historical record shows that in the council chamber, when the exile vote was read, you smiled. I've seen the footage. Can you tell me why?" Yael Oren was quiet for a moment. She looked out the window. The sun was in a bright phase today, and the light was very gold. Then she said, "How much do you know about human history?" Tev said he knew some. He had studied the broad outline for the book. She said, "Do you know how humans colonized their own planet?" He said he knew the basic facts. Humans had originated in one region of their world, and spread outward over tens of thousands of years, until they covered the whole surface. She nodded. She said there's a pattern in how that happened. Every time a group of humans was pushed out, by conflict, by famine, by other people who wanted their space, they ended up somewhere new. Sometimes the new place was worse than where they started. Sometimes it was much worse. Cold or dry or difficult. No roads, no networks, no support. And what happened, almost every time, was that they built something. She paused to drink her tea. "Not always something good," she said. "Not always something we're proud of, but something. We have this problem, or maybe this gift, I'm not sure which, where a blank space doesn't feel like a threat to us. It feels like a question. What can we make of this? The worse the conditions, sometimes, the more focused the answer." Tev asked when she had started thinking about the Fringe as an opportunity. She said, "When I read the Council's survey report, the one that said the Fringe had no value. They looked at 7 unstable systems and ruins they couldn't read, and called it worthless. And I thought, that is exactly what people have said about every place humans have ever built something worth keeping." She set her tea down. "The Aethon ruins alone," she said. "The Council had been to that site, their best xenoarchaeologists, and they came back and said it was unrecoverable because their instruments couldn't read the material. And I thought, if you sent humans to that site, humans who could not afford to give up, who had nothing else, do you know what they would do? They would pick up the pieces with their hands. They would taste them if they had to. They would not come home until they understood." She looked at Tev with those steady eyes. "The Council gave us the ruins of a 40,000-year-old civilization and called it a punishment. They gave us systems no one wanted and called it exile. They took away every support structure we had and called it a sentence. She paused. They handed us everything we needed to become something they had never imagined, and they did it while we watched. That's why I smiled. Tev was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if she'd known it would work out. She thought about that. Outside the window, a compact cargo lifter moved slowly across the sky between two of the city's larger station rings. It was a Vreth-built model, recognizable by the wide flat hull. Its navigation lights blinked slow and steady. "No," she said finally. "I didn't know. I thought it was possible. I thought the conditions were right. But no." She watched the cargo lifter until it passed out of sight. "You just decide it's worth trying, and you start." The interview ran a little over 2 hours. Tev thanked her at the end, and she waved the thanks away and told him to send her the book when it was finished. He said he would. He put his recorder away and gathered his notes. As he was leaving, he stopped at the door and turned back. He asked one more question, not from his prepared list, just something that had been sitting in the back of his mind since he sat down. He asked if she ever thought about what the council was doing now. Yael Oren turned back to her window. The fringed sun was high now, and the gold had shifted to something cleaner and brighter, the light that came when the star was at its steadiest. It lit the city below in clear, sharp lines. 30 years ago that city had been a shelf of rock and a cluster of pressurized modules. Now it had streets and schools and a library with 7 floors and a tower that was still being built. She picked up her tea. "Sometimes," she said. "Usually I'm thinking about what we're doing next." She smiled. It was small and quiet and almost private. Tev recognized it from the footage. He understood it now. He left her to her window and her tea and the gold morning light, and he walked out through the city that had once been nothing, and thought about blank spaces and the people who looked at them and asked what could be built there.